All I wanted was 1 hour of peace. I switched off my location, and my wife exploded with accusations of cheating. What happened next showed me I'd been living in a prison I didn't even recognize. I'm Mitchell, 43 years old, and I fix industrial equipment for a living, the kind of machinery that keeps factories running and pays decent enough that my wife Rachel could stay home with our 4-year-old son without us worrying about bills. For the past year, Rachel had been spending 3 evenings a week at a pottery studio downtown, which meant I handled bedtime routines, bath time negotiations, and the endless cycle of snack requests and potty trips while she threw clay and socialized with her studio friends. I never complained about this arrangement because honestly, I believed in her having personal outlets and time to pursue interests beyond motherhood. What I didn't expect was how impossible it would become for me to claim even a fraction of that same consideration for myself. The conversation started reasonably enough one Tuesday evening after I'd gotten our son down and found Rachel glazing a new bowl at the kitchen table, her hands still covered in dried clay from her studio session. "I've been thinking," I said, pouring myself coffee that had gone lukewarm hours ago, "maybe I could have a couple hours each week for myself too, just some quiet time to recharge like you do with pottery." Rachel looked up from her bowl, nodding in that distracted way people do when they're agreeing without really listening. "Sure, that sounds fair," she said, returning immediately to her glaze work. "When were you thinking?" I suggested Saturday afternoons, maybe from 2 to 4, which would give me a small window while our son napped or played independently, nothing extravagant, just a fraction of the 9 hours weekly Rachel spent at her studio. She agreed without hesitation, and I felt genuinely hopeful that we'd found a balanced arrangement that respected both our needs for individual space within the constraints of parenting and marriage. That hope lasted exactly 1 week before the violations started, subtle at first but unmistakably deliberate. The following Saturday, I'd set up in our home office with a book I'd been trying to read for 3 months, door closed, 2 hours of promised solitude stretching ahead of me like a gift. 20 minutes in, Rachel opened the door without knocking. "Hey, sorry to interrupt, but do you think we should get the gutters cleaned this month or wait until fall?" I looked up from my book, the paragraph I'd just read already evaporating from my memory. "Can we talk about this later? This is my quiet time." Rachel's expression flickered with something I couldn't quite identify. Annoyance, maybe, or surprise that I'd actually enforced the boundary we'd agreed upon. "It'll just take a second," she said, stepping fully into the room and leaning against my desk. "I'm trying to plan the home maintenance budget and I need your input now." We spent 15 minutes discussing gutter cleaning, a conversation that absolutely could have waited, and by the time she left, I'd lost the thread of what I'd been reading and the peaceful mindset I'd carefully cultivated. The next Saturday, she interrupted to tell me our son was asking for me, and when I went downstairs, I found him happily building block towers with zero apparent distress about my absence. The Saturday after that, Rachel needed help deciding between 2 different brands of laundry detergent she was considering buying online, a decision that somehow required my immediate consultation during my designated personal time. Each interruption came with plausible justification, each violation was wrapped in the language of practical necessity, but the pattern was unmistakable. My quiet time existed in theory but was systematically dismantled in practice. I tried addressing it directly after the 4th consecutive interrupted Saturday, choosing my words carefully to avoid sounding accusatory. "I've noticed you've needed to talk to me during my personal time every week," I said while we were doing dishes together one evening. "I'm wondering if we could save non-urgent things for before or after those 2 hours. Rachel's hands stopped moving in the soapy water, and when she turned to look at me, her face had hardened into an expression I'd been seeing more frequently. "Non-urgent? Our son asking for his father isn't urgent? Planning our household budget isn't important?" I explained that of course those things mattered, but that she managed to make dozens of decisions independently during the 9 hours weekly she spent at her studio, so perhaps some of these conversations could happen outside my much smaller window of personal time. She went quiet in that particular way that meant the conversation was over but the resentment would linger, and I knew I'd somehow become the unreasonable one for wanting the boundary we'd mutually agreed upon to actually function. The following Saturday, I decided to try a different approach. If personal time at home was impossible to protect, Maybe I needed to physically remove myself from the house where interruptions felt justified by proximity. I drove to a bookstore cafe about 15 minutes away, found a corner table with good light, and settled in with my notebook and a coffee, feeling that rare sensation of mental space opening up around me. I was maybe 40 minutes into sketching some ideas for a workbench I wanted to build when I heard a familiar voice cutting through the cafe's quiet atmosphere. "There you are. We've been looking everywhere for you." Rachel was walking toward my table with our son on her hip, talking at a volume that made several nearby customers look up from their laptops and books. "I thought we could make this a family bonding opportunity since you were out anyway." I stared at her, genuinely confused about how she'd found me since I hadn't mentioned my destination, before remembering the location sharing we'd set up years ago for safety purposes during road trips. "This is my personal time," I said quietly, aware of the attention we were drawing. "We agreed I could have these 2 hours." Rachel pulled out the chair across from me without invitation and set our son down, who immediately started grabbing sugar packets from the table dispenser. "And I agreed you could have personal time, but that doesn't mean you get to disappear without telling me where you are," she said, her voice still carrying across the cafe. "What if there was an emergency? What if something happened to our son and I couldn't reach you?" I pointed out that my phone was on, that she could call or text anytime, that location sharing was meant for actual emergencies rather than tracking my movements during agreed-upon personal time. Rachel launched into a story about her friend's husband who'd claimed to need personal time but was actually meeting someone else, talking loudly enough that I saw a woman at the next table glance over with obvious interest in our domestic drama. For the next hour, there was no reading, no sketching, no quiet, just Rachel narrating neighborhood gossip while our son colored on napkins and knocked over my water glass. The peaceful cafe retreat I'd hoped for completely dissolved into exactly the kind of family chaos I'd needed a brief break from. When we finally left, Rachel seemed satisfied, as if she'd successfully reclaimed me from some dangerous solitude, while I felt the familiar weight of resignation settling back onto my shoulders. The next week, I tried again, this time at a downtown botanical gardens I'd visited once during college and remembered as peaceful. I told Rachel I'd be gone for my 2 hours but deliberately didn't specify where, and I turned off my location sharing before leaving, not to hide anything illicit but simply to protect the boundary that seemed impossible to maintain any other way. The gardens were perfect: quiet pathways, late spring blooms, benches positioned among carefully maintained plant collections where I could sit and sketch without interruption. I filled several pages of my notebook with drawings of unusual leaf patterns and flower structures, losing myself in the meditative focus that comes from really observing something carefully. For 2 hours, nobody needed my input on household decisions, nobody required my immediate attention for non-urgent matters, nobody was testing whether I'd actually enforce my own boundaries. I felt my shoulders unknot, my breathing deepen, my mind clear in a way that hadn't happened in months. When I pulled into our driveway exactly 2 hours after leaving, feeling genuinely recharged for the first time in recent memory, I found Rachel standing on the front porch with her arms crossed, her posture radiating fury, and I knew immediately that my peaceful afternoon had come at a price I hadn't anticipated paying. Rachel didn't wait for me to reach the porch before starting. "Give me your phone right now," she demanded, her hand already extended, fingers opening and closing impatiently. I stopped halfway up the walkway, genuinely confused by the intensity of her anger when I'd returned exactly when promised. "What's going on?" I asked, pulling my phone from my pocket but not handing it over yet. "You know exactly what's going on," she said, her voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "You turned off your location, disappeared for 2 hours without telling me where you were going, and now you're going to stand there and pretend like that's normal behavior?" I explained that I'd gone to the botanical gardens downtown, that I'd simply wanted my agreed-upon personal time without interruption, that turning off location sharing wasn't about hiding anything but about protecting the boundary that seemed impossible to maintain otherwise. Rachel's expression shifted from anger to something colder and more frightening, absolute certainty that she'd uncovered a betrayal. "The botanical gardens," she repeated, her tone dripping with disbelief. "You expect me to believe you spent 2 hours alone looking at plants? Who are you really with, Mitchell? Who is she?" The accusation hit me like cold water, so absurd and unexpected that I actually laughed, which turned out to be exactly the wrong response. Rachel's face went white, then red, and she stepped closer with her hands still outstretched. "Give me the phone now, or I swear I'm calling my sister and telling her you're refusing to let me see what you're hiding." I unlocked my phone and handed it to her, watching as she immediately opened my messages, then my email, then my social media apps, scrolling frantically through conversations with coworkers and my brother and the group chat I had with guys from my Tuesday bowling league. "There's nothing there because I wasn't with anyone," I said quietly. "I have sketches from the gardens in my notebook in the car, and a parking receipt with the timestamp if you want to see it." Rachel barely glanced up from my phone. "You could have made sketches anywhere, and parking receipts prove nothing except that you were somewhere downtown, which I already know because you finally turned your location back on when you got close to home." I retrieved my notebook from the car and showed her the dated sketches of specific plants, pointed out details that could only have been drawn from direct observation, explained that the botanical gardens had been nearly empty on a Tuesday afternoon, which was exactly why I'd chosen it. Rachel flipped through the pages with increasing agitation, then closed the notebook and shoved it back at me. "This doesn't prove anything except that you're good at creating cover stories," she said. "The fact that you needed to hide your location at all tells me everything I need to know about what you were really doing." The conversation went in circles for another 30 minutes, with me explaining and Rachel reinterpreting every explanation as evidence of deception, until I finally gave up and went inside to check on our son who was watching cartoons with Rachel's mother. Apparently Rachel had called her to babysit the moment she realized my location was off, which meant she'd spent my entire 2 hours of personal time catastrophizing about where I was instead of simply trusting that I'd return when promised. That night, Rachel moved to the guest room without explanation, and I lay awake in our bed wondering how requesting 2 hours of solitude weekly had somehow transformed me into a suspected cheater in my wife's imagination. Over the following days, Rachel's behavior shifted into patterns I'd never seen in our 7 years of marriage. She started texting her divorced sister constantly, her phone always in her hand, her face illuminated by the screen even during meals. I caught glimpses of their conversation threads when she left her phone face up on the counter, screenshots of my bland responses to her questions about what I was doing, annotated with her sister's commentary about classic cheater deflection tactics, and emotional distance as a warning sign. Rachel's sister had gone through a bitter divorce 2 years earlier after discovering her husband's affair, and apparently every vague or brief text response I sent was now being filtered through that traumatic lens and presented back to Rachel as confirmation of infidelity. The atmosphere in our house became glacial, with Rachel monitoring my every movement with barely concealed suspicion. She started checking my laundry, running her hands through pockets looking for receipts or evidence I couldn't imagine. When I asked what she was looking for, she'd say, "Nothing," in a tone that meant everything, then continue her search with theatrical thoroughness. She made passive-aggressive comments during dinner about how some husbands valued their families enough to prioritize them over mysterious disappearances, and when I pointed out that her pottery studio time constituted 9 hours weekly of her own mysterious disappearances, she said that was completely different because she wasn't hiding where she was going. I tried having my personal time at home again the following Saturday, thinking maybe the location issue was really the core problem despite how irrational that seemed. I went down to our basement den with the intention of watching some classic westerns I'd recorded months ago, films I'd grown up watching with my father and found comforting in their straightforward morality. 15 minutes into the first film, Rachel appeared at the bottom of the stairs. "What are you watching?" she asked, though she could clearly see the television from where she stood. I told her it was an old John Wayne film, one I'd seen probably 20 times. She nodded and went back upstairs, and I pressed play again, trying to recapture the relaxed mindset I'd briefly achieved. 10 minutes later, she was back, this time settling onto the couch beside me without asking. "I thought I'd watch with you," she announced. "We never spend time together anymore." I wanted to point out that we spent virtually every waking moment together except for her pottery studio time and my apparently unforgivable request for 2 hours weekly, but I'd learned that defending my boundaries had become evidence of their necessity being suspicious. We watched in silence for maybe 20 minutes before Rachel started commentary. It's funny how these old movies treat women like decorations, she observed. Just standing around waiting to be rescued while men do all the interesting things. I made a non-committal sound, trying to focus on the film. I mean, look at her, Rachel continued, gesturing at the screen. Her entire character is just looking pretty and being grateful that John Wayne exists. That's literally her whole purpose. She wasn't wrong about the dated gender dynamics, but the running commentary was destroying any possibility of the quiet mental space I'd been seeking, which might have been the actual point. For the next hour, Rachel provided continuous analysis of the film's problematic elements, asked questions about plot points that were clearly explained in dialogue she'd talked over, and suggested that we could be doing productive couple activities instead of watching sexist cowboy nonsense that glorified toxic masculinity. Finally, I paused the movie and looked at her directly. "This is my personal time," I said as calmly as I could manage. "The 2 hours we agreed I could have for myself each week. I'm not trying to exclude you from my life, I'm trying to have a tiny fraction of the solitude you get 3 times a week at your studio." Rachel's face hardened into that expression I'd been seeing constantly lately. "Right? Your personal time that you need so desperately that you'll turn off your location and disappear rather than just be honest about where you're going," she said. "Forgive me for thinking that's suspicious behavior from someone who claims to have nothing to hide." I abandoned the movie entirely, turned off the television, and went back upstairs to the kitchen where I started preparing dinner in silence while Rachel returned to her phone and her sister's validating conspiracy theories. The basement den, like the bookstore cafe and the botanical gardens before it, had proven impossible as a refuge, not because these places were inherently problematic, but because Rachel had decided that my need for any space away from her constant presence was itself evidence of betrayal, and no amount of transparency or explanation could overcome her determination to see my simple request for occasional solitude as proof that I'd grown tired of our family and was secretly building an escape route through infidelity that existed only in her increasingly paranoid imagination. I made a decision that week that felt like surrender but seemed like the only path back to peace. I gave up entirely on personal time, hoping that this sacrifice would demonstrate my commitment and calm Rachel's fears. The following Saturday, when my theoretical 2 hours arrived, I stayed home and asked Rachel if she wanted to work on a puzzle together, something we used to enjoy before our son was born. She looked at me with suspicion rather than pleasure. "What about your precious alone time?" she asked, and I explained that clearly it was causing more problems than it solved, that I'd rather spend that time with her if it meant we could move past this tension. Rachel nodded slowly, but instead of the relief or appreciation I'd hoped to see, her expression suggested I'd confirmed something she'd already suspected, that my need for solitude had been about avoiding her specifically rather than seeking mental restoration generally. The sacrifice didn't restore peace, it made everything worse in ways I hadn't anticipated. Rachel stopped attending her pottery studio sessions entirely, claiming she needed to keep an eye on things at home, which meant she was now present constantly, watching me with barely concealed distrust even as I explicitly gave her no reason for suspicion. Our evenings, which used to involve comfortable routine and easy conversation after our son went to bed, became tense silences where Rachel scrolled through her phone and I pretended to read while actually wondering how our marriage had deteriorated so completely over such a simple boundary request. She started cold-shouldering me during meals, responding to my attempts at conversation with single-word answers or pointed silence, and our previous pattern of physical affection, quick kisses when passing in the hallway, her hand finding mine while we watched television, evaporated completely as if I'd become contaminated by my imaginary infidelity. One evening when Rachel was giving our son a bath, I noticed her phone sitting on the kitchen counter, unlocked and open to her messages with her sister. I knew I shouldn't look, that reading her private conversations violated the trust that was already so damaged, but I needed to understand what narrative was being constructed about me in those constant text exchanges. What I found was worse than I'd imagined: lengthy message threads where Rachel insisted she just knew I was being unfaithful despite lacking any concrete evidence, where she analyzed my every word and action through the lens of betrayal, where my calm responses to her accusations became proof of sociopathic manipulation rather than genuine innocence. Her sister's responses were consistently validating, encouraging Rachel to trust her intuition and protect herself financially, suggesting Rachel should start documenting everything in case she needed evidence for divorce proceedings. There were screenshots of my text messages where I'd said things like, "working late tonight," or "stopped for gas on the way home," with her sister's annotations pointing out that these were exactly the kinds of vague explanations cheaters use to account for their time. I set the phone down feeling sick, not from guilt but from the realization that Rachel had constructed an entire alternate reality where I was systematically unfaithful, and she'd found someone who would reinforce that delusion rather than question it. That night I tried to have a serious conversation with Rachel after our son was asleep, sitting down at the kitchen table and asking her directly what would actually prove to her that I wasn't cheating, what evidence she needed to trust me again. The conversation escalated within minutes into a shouting match where Rachel accused me of gaslighting her, of trying to make her doubt her own perceptions, of turning our entire marriage into an elaborate lie. "I know what I know," she kept saying, her voice rising with each repetition. "I can feel it in my gut that something's wrong, and you trying to convince me otherwise just proves you're hiding something." I asked what specifically I was hiding, what concrete evidence she had beyond her feelings, and she listed things that made my head spin with their interpretive reaches, that I'd seemed too cheerful after my botanical gardens visit, that I'd been distant for months even though I'd been handling bedtime routines and household tasks exactly as always, that my willingness to give up personal time was suspicious, because innocent people would fight harder to prove themselves. Every response I offered became additional evidence of deception in her framework, and I finally realized that this wasn't a conversation I could win through logic or reassurance because Rachel had already decided the verdict and was now just collecting anything that might be twisted into supporting evidence. Our evening walks together, the ones we used to take after putting our son to bed when the neighborhood was quiet and we'd talk about our days or our plans or nothing in particular, stopped completely. Rachel said she was too tired, but really she'd decided that any time we spent together was just me performing normalcy to cover my betrayal. She started sleeping in the guest room permanently, claiming I snored too loudly, though I'd apparently snored at the same volume for our entire marriage without it being a problem before. I'd wake up in the middle of the night and see light under the guest room door, knowing she was up scrolling through my old social media posts or my tagged photos, looking for hidden meanings or evidence of inappropriate relationships in images from years before we'd even met. I found myself constantly aware of her watching me, analyzing my expressions, timing how long I spent in the bathroom or how quickly I responded to her texts when I was at work. I confided in my older brother during a phone call one evening, telling him I felt like I was living with a stranger who'd decided I was guilty of a crime I'd never committed and couldn't prove my innocence because absence of evidence had become evidence of concealment in her reasoning. My brother, who'd been married for 15 years, suggested couples therapy, and I actually felt hope for the first time in weeks. Surely a neutral professional could help Rachel see that her fears were unfounded, that her sister's projections from her own failed marriage were poisoning a relationship that had been solid before I'd made one simple request for occasional solitude. When I proposed therapy to Rachel that evening, trying to frame it as an investment in our marriage and our family, her face went through a rapid succession of expressions before settling on cold certainty. "You want to manipulate a therapist into taking your side," she said flatly. "You want to get some professional to tell me I'm crazy for noticing that my husband turned off his location and disappeared, and then you'll use that as proof that I'm the problem." I explained that wasn't how therapy worked, that the goal was better communication and understanding rather than taking sides, but Rachel had already made up her mind that couples therapy was just another manipulation tactic, another way I was trying to gaslight her into doubting her intuition about my fabricated affair. The rejection of therapy felt like the final door closing on any possibility of repairing what had broken between us, and I lay awake that night in our bed that now felt too large, listening to Rachel moving around in the guest room, and wondered how a marriage could collapse so completely over something as simple and innocent as wanting 2 hours weekly to sketch in a botanical garden with my location sharing turned off. Father's Day arrived 3 weeks later, and I woke to find our son standing beside my bed holding a construction paper card he'd made with Rachel's help, stick figures labeled, "Daddy," and me, surrounded by crayon hearts. the kind of simple gift that makes parenthood feel worthwhile despite everything else falling apart. Rachel appeared in the doorway as our son climbed onto the bed to present his card, and for a moment, her expression softened into something resembling the woman I'd married, the one who used to smile at me with actual warmth rather than constant suspicion. "Happy Father's Day," she said quietly, and I thanked her for helping our son make the card, genuinely appreciative that she'd set aside her anger long enough to facilitate this moment. I suggested we make our son's favorite blueberry pancakes for breakfast, the ones with the little chocolate chips mixed in that technically violated our rule about sugar before noon but seemed appropriate for special occasions, and Rachel agreed without the usual debate about nutritional guidelines. We moved around the kitchen with practiced coordination developed over years of shared cooking, and the morning felt almost normal, our son chattering about the card he'd made, Rachel actually smiling when I flipped a pancake badly and it landed half on the stovetop, the three of us sitting together at the table like a real family rather than the tense simulation we'd been performing lately. I was starting to think maybe we'd turned some corner, that perhaps the pleasant morning was Rachel's way of signaling she was ready to move past the paranoia and rebuild what we damaged. Then I realized we were out of maple syrup halfway through breakfast, and the fragile piece shattered immediately. "I'll run to the store," I said, standing up from the table. "It's just 3 blocks away, I'll be back in 10 minutes. Rachel's expression changed instantly, the warmth draining from her face and being replaced by that now familiar look of cold suspicion. She didn't say anything, just watched me with narrowed eyes as I grabbed my keys and wallet, and I felt the familiar weight of her distrust settling back onto my shoulders like a physical presence. The grocery store was nearly empty this early on a Sunday, and I grabbed the syrup quickly before noticing that the artisan coffee roastery next door was open, the one that imported beans from small farms and did custom grinding. Rachel loved their Ethiopian blend, specifically the one with the bright citrus notes she said reminded her of better mornings before everything got complicated, and I thought maybe bringing home her favorite coffee would be a peace offering that showed I was thinking about her happiness even during a simple errand. The line at the roastery was longer than I'd expected, filled with Father's Day shoppers buying gift sets and people placing special orders, and I waited patiently while they measured and ground each order individually with the kind of careful attention that made their coffee worth the premium price. 20 minutes passed before I reached the counter, and another 10 before they'd ground the pound of Ethiopian beans and packaged it in their distinctive brown bag with the handwritten label. I checked my watch as I walked back to my car and realized I'd been gone 45 minutes instead of the promised 10, and a cold sense of dread washed over me because I knew exactly how Rachel would interpret this delay regardless of my innocent explanation. When I pulled into our driveway, Rachel was standing there waiting, our son visible through the front window playing with his toys, apparently unaware of the confrontation brewing outside. Rachel had her phone clutched in one hand, and she was visibly shaking, not with cold despite the warm June morning, but with barely controlled rage that radiated from her posture like heat waves. I got out of the car holding the grocery bag with the syrup and the coffee roastery bag, already formulating my explanation, but Rachel started screaming before I'd taken 3 steps toward the house. 45 minutes, she shouted, her voice carrying across our quiet suburban street where I could see a neighbor watering their garden stop and turn to watch. The grocery store is 10 minutes away. Where the hell were you really, Mitchell? Who were you with? I held up the coffee bag, trying to explain that I'd stopped to get her favorite Ethiopian blend as a Father's Day gesture, that the roastery had a line and each order took time because they ground everything fresh. Rachel snatched the bag from my hand and looked at it with pure contempt, her face twisted into an expression of disgust I'd never seen directed at me before. "Proof of nothing," she spat. "You bought coffee to establish an alibi. That's what people do when they're trying to cover their tracks. You think I'm stupid enough to believe you spent 35 extra minutes waiting in line for coffee?" I pulled out my phone to show her the timestamp on my credit card notification from the roastery, the digital receipt that would prove exactly when I'd made the purchase, but Rachel wasn't interested in evidence that contradicted her predetermined conclusion. She walked directly to our recycling bin at the side of the house, opened the lid, and dumped the entire bag of expensive coffee inside without ceremony, the brown bag landing on top of cardboard and plastic with a soft thud that somehow felt louder than her shouting. "That's what I think of your alibi," she said, turning back to face me with tears streaming down her face now, though whether from anger or hurt or some combination I couldn't determine. "I'm done pretending everything's fine when I know you're lying to me." Our son appeared at the front door then, his small face pressed against the screen with obvious confusion about why Mommy and Daddy were yelling in the driveway on Father's Day, and I felt my heart break watching him witness this disintegration of his parents' marriage over artisan coffee and false accusations. Rachel saw him too, and something shifted in her expression, not softening exactly, but focusing, as if she just remembered she had an audience for her certainty about my betrayal. She went inside without another word to me, and I stood in the driveway holding a bag of pancake syrup while my Father's Day dissolved into exactly the kind of nightmare I'd been watching approach for weeks but had been powerless to prevent. I waited outside for 10 minutes, hoping Rachel would calm down and we could salvage something from the morning, but when I finally went inside, I found her in our bedroom throwing clothes into an overnight bag with mechanical efficiency. "What are you doing?" I asked, though I already knew the answer and felt my stomach drop with the weight of inevitability. "I'm done," Rachel said without looking at me, grabbing our son's favorite stuffed dinosaur from his room and adding it to the bag. "I'm done pretending I don't know what's happening, done waiting for you to be honest, done living in a house with someone who thinks I'm too stupid to see the truth." She packed essentials for our son with the practiced speed of someone who'd mentally rehearsed this departure, and within 15 minutes she had both bags by the front door and was buckling our son into his car seat despite his protests about leaving his toys behind. I tried to stop her, tried to explain one more time that nothing had happened beyond a simple coffee purchase, but Rachel's face had set into that expression of absolute certainty that I'd learned meant further conversation was pointless. "I'm going to my parents'," she said, opening the driver's door. "Don't call me, don't text me, don't show up there. I need space to figure out what I'm doing next, and I need you to stay away from me and our son until I decide whether this marriage is salvageable." The "whether" hit me harder than anything else she'd said, not "until we work this out," but "whether this marriage is salvageable," as if my guilt was established fact and the only question remaining was whether she could forgive the betrayal I'd never committed. She pulled out of the driveway while our son waved at me through the rear window, his small hand pressed against the glass, and I stood there watching them disappear down our street while neighbors pretended not to stare at the obvious domestic crisis playing out on what should have been a peaceful Sunday morning celebrating fatherhood. I went back inside to a house that felt immediately too quiet, too empty, the Father's Day card still sitting on the kitchen table next to plates of half-eaten pancakes going cold, and I picked up my phone to call Rachel before remembering she'd explicitly told me not to contact her. I tried anyway, sending a single text that said, "Please let me know you and our son arrived safely at your parents'," but the message showed as delivered but not read, and I suspected she'd already blocked my number in the 40-minute drive across town to her childhood home where she'd apparently decided she needed refuge from the husband who'd committed the unforgivable crime of buying her favorite coffee on Father's Day morning. 2 weeks passed in complete silence before I finally consulted a family law attorney, a practical step I'd been avoiding because seeking legal counsel felt like admitting the marriage was truly over rather than just temporarily damaged. The attorney, a woman in her 50s named Patricia who'd apparently seen every variation of marital collapse, listened to my story with the detached professionalism of someone who heard similar narratives daily, then delivered news that made my situation feel even more hopeless. "Given that Rachel hasn't been employed since your son was born," Patricia explained, reviewing the financial documents I'd brought, "you'll likely owe both spousal support and child support regardless of who initiated the separation or what the underlying circumstances were." She walked me through preliminary calculations that showed substantial monthly payments that would strain my budget considerably, and explained that my request for 2 hours of weekly personal time would be irrelevant to the court's determination of financial obligations. Marriage dissolution was primarily a mathematical equation based on income disparity and custody arrangements, not a moral judgment about who'd behaved reasonably. I asked about custody, about how often I'd get to see my son, and Patricia's expression suggested she was preparing me for disappointment. "We'll request a fair arrangement, but given that you work full-time and Rachel has been the primary caregiver, courts typically favor maintaining continuity for young children," she said. "We can probably negotiate alternating weeks eventually, but initially you should expect something more limited while we establish that you're a capable and engaged parent." The phrase, "establish that you're a capable and engaged parent," stung. I'd been handling bedtime routines 3 nights weekly for years, had never missed a pediatrician appointment, knew my son's allergies and favorite books and the specific way he liked his sandwich cut, but apparently Rachel's narrative about my suspicious behavior might be enough to cast doubt on my parental fitness. Patricia drew up preliminary documents suggesting alternating weekly custody, and I signed them feeling like I was participating in the dismantling of my own life. Rachel's response came through her attorney 2 days later, a counterproposal demanding that I have only every other weekend, citing my erratic need for isolation as concerning behavior that suggested emotional instability unsuitable for extended parenting periods. I read the legal language with growing fury, seeing how my simple request for personal time had been weaponized into evidence of psychological problems, how Rachel had successfully reframed my boundary setting as pathology that threatened our son's well-being. Patricia advised me not to engage emotionally with the accusations, that family court was about documentation and strategy rather than justice, but I couldn't help feeling the profound unfairness of being painted as unstable when Rachel was the one who'd constructed an elaborate infidelity fantasy from absolutely nothing. Rachel did allow supervised visits twice weekly at her parents' house, and I drove across town every Tuesday and Thursday evening to spend 2 hours with my son in their living room while Rachel's mother hovered nearby with barely concealed hostility and Rachel herself stayed in another room like I was contaminated. My son would run to me with genuine excitement, showing me drawings he'd made or telling me stories about his days, and I'd feel simultaneous joy at seeing him and rage at the artificial constraints on our relationship. Rachel's mother would interrupt our play periodically to announce snack time or bathroom breaks or arbitrary schedule requirements that felt designed to remind me I was there on their terms, not as a father with inherent rights to his child. The worst part was when my son would ask questions that were clearly prompted by Rachel, innocent 4-year-old inquiries delivered without understanding their implication. "Mommy says you have new friends now," he'd say while we were building block towers. "Do you have new friends, Daddy?" I'd explain that I had the same friends I'd always had, that nothing had changed except where I was living temporarily, and I'd see Rachel's mother's expression tighten with disapproval as if my honest answer was somehow inappropriate coaching. During one visit, my son asked if I was sad, and when I admitted that yes, I missed living with him and Mommy, he said, "Mommy's sad too because you went away," and I had to bite back the correction that I hadn't gone anywhere, that Rachel had left with him and blocked all my attempts at communication. Patricia filed our custody proposal formally, and the waiting period for family court stretched out ahead of me like a prison sentence, months of limited access to my son while attorneys argued about whether requesting 2 hours of weekly solitude constituted evidence of parental unfitness. My friends rallied around me with the kind of support I hadn't expected. My bowling league teammates started checking in regularly, my brother called every few days to let me vent, even my coworkers who'd met Rachel at company events expressed shock at how she'd interpreted my botanical gardens visit as proof of an affair. Several friends offered to provide statements to my attorney confirming they'd witnessed Rachel's increasingly controlling behavior over the past year, her pattern of violating agreed-upon boundaries and then punishing me for attempting to maintain them. But other friends, particularly the couples we'd socialized with regularly, started distancing themselves in ways that stung worse than outright hostility, unanswered texts, vague excuses about being busy, the social awkwardness that comes when people have clearly chosen sides in a divorce they don't fully understand. I ran into our neighbor Karen at the grocery store, and she gave me a sympathetic smile that felt more pitying than supportive. "Rachel told us what happened," she said quietly, as if discussing something shameful. "I hope you can work things out for your son's sake." I wanted to ask what exactly Rachel had told her, what version of events was circulating through our neighborhood, but Karen hurried away before I could formulate a response, leaving me standing by the produce section wondering how many people now believed I was a cheater based solely on Rachel's paranoid interpretation of artisan coffee and botanical garden sketches. I started seeing a therapist named Dr. Lauren who specialized in divorce and co-parenting, initially just because Patricia suggested it would look good for custody proceedings but eventually because I genuinely needed help processing the guilt I felt about our son growing up in a divided household. Dr. Lauren listened to my story over several sessions before offering an observation that shifted something fundamental in how I understood what had happened. Rachel's behavior pattern suggests she may have anxiety disorders or control issues that predate your request for personal time, Dr. Lauren said during our fourth session. Your boundary setting likely triggered existing fears rather than creating new ones, and her response escalated because she interpreted your need for space as rejection or abandonment. She helped me recognize patterns of emotional manipulation I'd been accepting as normal, the way Rachel had agreed to arrangements then systematically violated them, the constant testing of whether I'd enforce my own boundaries, the punishment through guilt and accusation when I attempted to maintain reasonable limits on her access to my time and attention. Dr. Lauren explained that healthy relationships involved both people maintaining individual identities alongside their couple identity, that my request for 2 hours weekly wasn't selfish or suspicious but actually necessary for psychological well-being, and that Rachel's inability to tolerate any separation likely reflected her own unaddressed issues rather than anything deficient in me. The validation helped, but it didn't ease the practical reality that my son was growing up watching his parents live separately because I'd wanted to sketch plants in a garden with my location turned off. During one session, my brother asked me directly the question I knew many people were probably wondering privately. "Did you ever cheat on Rachel?" he said, his tone suggesting he'd believe whatever answer I gave but needed to hear me say it explicitly. I broke down then, not from guilt but from the overwhelming exhaustion of being suspected of a betrayal I'd never committed or even contemplated. I never even thought about another woman. I told him through tears I hadn't realized I'd been holding back. I just wanted 2 hours a week to sit quietly and sketch and not have to answer questions about gutter cleaning or laundry detergent or justify my existence constantly. That's literally all I wanted, just a tiny fraction of the solitude Rachel got 3 times a week, and somehow that became proof that I was destroying our family through secret infidelity that only existed in her imagination. My brother hugged me, his own eyes wet, and said what I'd needed someone to say for weeks. "You asked for something completely reasonable, and Rachel responded like you'd committed an unforgivable crime. That's on her, not you." 3 months into the separation, I signed a lease on a small rental townhouse in a neighborhood closer to my work, a 2-bedroom unit with generic beige walls and industrial carpet that felt nothing like home but represented a necessary step toward accepting this was my life now. I spent a weekend furnishing the spare bedroom specifically for my son's visits, assembling the wooden train set he'd loved at our old house, hanging glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling the way we'd done in his room before everything fell apart, arranging his favorite books on a small bookshelf I'd painted bright blue because he'd told me during a supervised visit that blue was his favorite color this week. Rachel continued living in our former family home, the mortgage and utilities covered by the support payments that left my own budget significantly tighter, and I tried not to think about her occupying the space we'd chosen together while I lived in temporary housing that felt like an extended stay in someone else's life. She'd started posting on social media again after weeks of silence, cryptic messages about rebuilding after betrayal and finding strength in difficult times, that her friends enthusiastically supported with comments full of prayer hands and heart emojis. I'd blocked her accounts to avoid the temptation of checking them obsessively, but mutual friends would occasionally mention seeing her posts, their tone suggesting they believed whatever narrative she was constructing about our separation. The custody arrangement had settled into a pattern that felt inadequate but was apparently the best I could expect given the circumstances. I had my son every Thursday evening from 5 to 8, and alternate weekends from Friday evening through Sunday afternoon. I focused entirely on being present during those limited hours, taking him to the Children's Museum where he loved the water play exhibit, teaching him to ride his bike with training wheels in the parking lot behind my townhouse, reading his favorite dinosaur books until he fell asleep in the bed I'd set up specifically for him. We established rituals that belonged just to us. Thursday evenings were pizza night where he got to choose all the toppings. Weekend mornings started with chocolate chip pancakes that Rachel would probably disapprove of but weren't her concern anymore, and every night before bed I'd video call him from my phone so he could see my face when I said goodnight even during the days I couldn't physically be with him. Rachel's expression during those video calls, visible in the background or hovering just off-screen, ranged from disapproving to openly hostile, but she couldn't deny me those brief connections without looking unreasonable to the family court mediator who'd mandated consistent contact. My therapist, Dr. Lauren, helped me understand that I couldn't control Rachel's perception of reality if she was fundamentally unwilling to examine her own thought patterns and acknowledge that her fears had been unfounded. "You've provided transparency, consistency, and patience," Dr. Lauren said during one session. "If that's not enough to overcome her conviction that you betrayed her, then the problem exists in her interpretation rather than your behavior, and you can't fix someone else's distorted lens no matter how clearly you present the truth." She helped me work through the guilt I felt about our son experiencing this divided life, reminded me that children were resilient and that maintaining a strong relationship with both parents mattered more than those parents living under the same roof, encouraged me to focus on what I could control: my own consistency, my emotional availability during custody time, my refusal to speak negatively about Rachel in front of our son regardless of how she might be characterizing me to him. The work was exhausting but necessary, and I slowly started accepting that the marriage I'd tried to save through reasonable compromise and transparent communication had been unsalvageable the moment Rachel decided to believe the worst despite all evidence to the contrary. Through my brother, who remained in occasional contact with some of our mutual friends, I learned that Rachel had been telling people at our son's preschool that I'd abandoned the family, a characterization so far from reality that I had to schedule an awkward meeting with the preschool director to clarify the custody situation and ensure the staff understood I was an actively involved parent with legal rights to pick up my son during my designated times. The director, a kind woman named Mrs. Peterson who'd known our son since he started at the school 2 years earlier, listened to my explanation with professional neutrality before assuring me that they maintained detailed custody documentation and wouldn't release my son to anyone not authorized, regardless of what narrative either parent presented. The fact that I needed to have this conversation at all, that Rachel's story about abandonment required official correction, felt like another small betrayal in a series that had started with her dumping expensive coffee in the recycling bin and escalated to her taking our son across town while blocking my attempts to communicate. Despite the pain of the separation and the logistical complications of divided custody, I noticed changes in myself that felt like recovery from an illness I hadn't fully recognized while experiencing it. I was sleeping better in my sparse townhouse bedroom than I had in months at our family home, no longer lying awake wondering what I'd done wrong or how I could prove my innocence to someone determined to see guilt. I wasn't walking on eggshells constantly, monitoring my words and actions to avoid triggering Rachel's suspicion, explaining my whereabouts with the thoroughness of a suspect providing an alibi. I could go to the grocery store for milk without timing myself to ensure I returned within the expected window, could respond to work emails in the evening without Rachel questioning why I was really on my phone, could exist without constant surveillance from someone who decided my basic need for occasional solitude was evidence of moral failure. On Thursday evenings when I picked up my son from preschool for our custody time, I'd feel my shoulders relax as we drove back to my townhouse, the pressure of performing perfect transparency finally lifting for those precious hours when I could just be his father without someone analyzing every interaction for hidden meanings. I started sketching again during the evenings after he fell asleep or during the days when I didn't have custody, filling notebooks with plant drawings and mechanical designs and abstract patterns that emerged from my pencil without conscious planning. The activity that had somehow triggered this entire catastrophe became therapeutic again, a way to quiet my mind and reconnect with the part of myself that existed independently of marriage and fatherhood and the obligation to justify my every movement to someone who decided justification was just sophisticated lying. My brother visited one Saturday when I didn't have custody, bringing beer and takeout from the Thai place we'd loved in college, and we sat in my mostly empty living room talking about everything except my disintegrating marriage. Eventually, though, he asked the question that had clearly been bothering him. "Are you angry at her?" he said, gesturing with his beer bottle. "Like, genuinely furious about what she's put you through?" I thought about it honestly before answering. "I was angry at first," I said. Angry that she couldn't trust me, angry that my reasonable boundary became evidence of betrayal, angry that our son is growing up in 2 houses because I wanted to sketch plans with my location off. But mostly now I just feel sad that Rachel needed to believe something was wrong more than she needed to trust the husband who'd never given her actual reason to doubt, sad that her sister's bitter divorce poisoned our marriage with paranoid projections, sad that I couldn't convince her that 2 hours of weekly solitude was about mental health rather than infidelity no matter how much transparency I provided. My brother nodded slowly, and we sat in comfortable silence for a while before he offered an observation that crystallized something I'd been circling around for months. You know, divorce, like marriage, only requires one person's decision, he said. Rachel chose to believe the worst despite all your evidence to the contrary, and once she made that choice, nothing you could say or do would overcome her determination to see betrayal where none existed. That's not your failure, that's hers. Patricia, my attorney, pushed back hard against Rachel's restrictive custody proposal during our preliminary hearing, presenting documentation of my consistent involvement in childcare since our son's birth, pediatrician records showing I'd attended 90% of appointments, preschool logs confirming I'd handled regular drop-offs and pickups before the separation, testimony from neighbors who'd witnessed me managing solo parenting duties multiple evenings weekly while Rachel attended her pottery studio sessions. She argued that Rachel had demonstrated concerning controlling behaviors including systematic violation of mutually agreed boundaries, refusal to participate in couples therapy, and rapid escalation from minor boundary enforcement to complete family separation over fundamentally innocent actions. The judge, a stern woman who'd apparently heard every custody variation imaginable during her 20 years on the family court bench, listened to both sides with visible impatience for the dramatic narratives and focus on the practical question of what arrangement served our son's best interests. After nearly 3 hours of testimony and argument, she ordered a temporary custody agreement granting me every Thursday evening and alternate weekends, with a provision for review in 6 months once we'd established how the arrangement functioned in practice and whether my work schedule and living situation remained stable enough to support expanded custody. It wasn't the alternating weeks I'd hoped for, but it was significantly better than the every other weekend arrangement Rachel had demanded, and Patricia assured me that demonstrating consistency during this trial period would strengthen our case for more equal custody eventually. I left the courthouse feeling exhausted but cautiously optimistic that the legal system had at least partially recognized Rachel's narrative about my abandonment didn't match the documented reality of my involvement as a parent. Online, the story I'd posted anonymously on a relationship forum seeking advice during the worst of the separation had gained substantial attention, with hundreds of comments from people who'd followed the situation from my initial request for personal time through Rachel's paranoid accusations to our eventual separation. The overwhelming majority of commenters supported me, pointing out that Rachel's inability to honor a basic boundary and her immediate leap to infidelity accusations without evidence suggested deeper psychological issues she was refusing to address through therapy or honest self-examination. Several mental health professionals who participated in the forum noted patterns consistent with anxiety disorders, control issues, and possible personality disorders that manifested in extreme fear of abandonment and compensatory hypervigilance over partner behavior. Multiple people observed that Rachel's divorced sister had likely projected her own marriage trauma onto Rachel's situation, poisoning a salvageable relationship with paranoid interpretations that confirmed Rachel's worst fears rather than encouraging her to examine whether those fears had any basis in reality. A few voices in the comments suggested I should have communicated better or tried harder to address what seemed like Rachel's loneliness as a stay-at-home parent, theorizing that my request for personal time had triggered legitimate feelings of isolation that I'd failed to recognize or validate. But the vast majority recognized that Rachel had explicitly agreed to the arrangement, violated it repeatedly through systematic interruptions and boundary testing, then blamed me when I sought my promised solitude in locations where her violations were physically impossible, that this pattern suggested the problem existed in her need for control rather than my need for occasional mental space, and that no amount of my accommodation would have satisfied someone determined to interpret reasonable boundaries as evidence of betrayal. I continued therapy with Dr. Lauren, processing the grief of losing my marriage to unfounded accusations and learning to separate my self-worth from Rachel's distorted narrative about our relationship and the events that led to our separation. She helped me understand that I'd done everything a reasonable person could do. I'd negotiated boundaries explicitly rather than assuming unspoken agreement. I'd provided transparency about my activities when accused. I'd offered evidence including sketches and receipts and timestamps. I'd suggested couples therapy to address the underlying trust issues with professional mediation. I'd even surrendered my personal time entirely in a failed attempt to demonstrate commitment. At some point, Dr. Lauren said during one of our sessions, "You have to accept that another person's perception of reality is their responsibility to examine and correct, not yours to manage through increasingly elaborate proof of innocence. You can't logic someone out of a position they didn't logic themselves into, especially when that position serves psychological needs you don't fully understand and they won't acknowledge." The work of accepting this truth was harder than I'd anticipated, requiring me to release the fantasy that if I'd just explained better or provided one more piece of evidence or found the right words, Rachel would have suddenly recognized her fears were unfounded and we could have rebuilt what we'd broken. My brother visited regularly, often bringing dinner or just sitting with me during the evenings when I didn't have custody and the townhouse felt particularly empty, reminding me that I hadn't failed at marriage so much as discovered that my marriage had been built on shakier foundations than I'd realized. That someone who could discard 7 years that easily over a simple boundary request had never been as invested in our partnership as I'd believed, and that this painful revelation was ultimately better than continuing to build a future on trust that didn't actually exist. He'd tell me stories about his own marriage struggles, not to minimize my pain but to remind me that all relationships required both people to choose connection over fear, and that when one person chose fear instead, the other person's efforts alone couldn't sustain what had been abandoned from the other side. 6 months after the separation, I'd established a stable routine that felt increasingly like actual life rather than temporary crisis management. My son knew which days were daddy days and which were mommy days, had favorite activities specific to each household, seemed to be adjusting to the divided arrangement with the resilience children somehow managed despite their parents' failures. We had inside jokes now, rituals that belonged only to us, ways of being together that didn't require anyone else's approval or oversight. He'd started calling my townhouse Daddy's house, with the same casual ownership he used for Mommy's house, suggesting he'd internalized the new normal even if it wasn't the one I'd hoped to provide him. I returned to my Tuesday evening sketching group at the community center, a weekly gathering of amateur artists who met to draw still life arrangements and share techniques without judgment or pressure. The first night back felt awkward, explaining my absence with vague references to family stuff, while the other members tactfully didn't press for details. But by the third week I'd settled back into the comfortable rhythm of quiet creation alongside others who understood that some people needed visual expression the way others needed conversation or music or physical activity. The group coordinator, an elderly man named Frank who'd been sketching for 60 years, pulled me aside after one session to say he was glad I'd returned, that my absence had been noticed and my presence contributed something valuable to the collective energy even when I felt like I was just copying what I saw rather than creating anything original. His casual affirmation reminded me that I had value beyond my role as husband or father or financial provider, that I existed as a complete person with interests and talents independent of the relationships that had defined so much of my identity for the past 7 years. I went to the botanical gardens one Saturday afternoon when I didn't have custody, walking the same paths I'd sketched 6 months earlier when my simple desire for peaceful solitude had somehow triggered the complete collapse of my marriage. The gardens looked different in late fall, the summer blooms replaced by autumn colors and architectural plants that maintained visual interest through seasonal change, and I sat on the same bench where I'd drawn leaf patterns and felt genuine peace for the first time in months back when I'd still believed my marriage was salvageable if I could just find the right words to explain myself. This time I didn't sketch. I just sat quietly, watching other visitors photograph the landscape and read on benches and exist in their own bubbles of solitude without anyone demanding explanation or justification, and I felt something close to acceptance settling over me like the afternoon light filtering through mostly bare branches. My marriage had ended not because I'd taken 2 hours at these gardens with my location sharing turned off, but because Rachel had needed to believe something was fundamentally wrong more than she'd needed to trust the husband who'd never given her actual reason to doubt, and no amount of my transparency or patience or evidence could have overcome her determination to see betrayal where none existed. That wasn't my failure or my responsibility to fix. It was simply the painful reality that sometimes people chose fear over trust, and those choices dissolved relationships regardless of how much the other person tried to prove they were trustworthy. I pulled out my phone and took a single photo of the garden view from my bench, not to post anywhere or show anyone, just to mark this moment when I'd returned to the place where everything fell apart and discovered I could sit there peacefully without drowning in regret about decisions I couldn't change. Then I drove back to my townhouse where my son's bedroom waited with glow-in-the-dark stars and his favorite books, where I'd built something stable and genuine even if it looked nothing like the future I'd imagined when I'd first asked for 2 hours of weekly personal time that somehow became unforgivable evidence of crimes I'd never committed, and I accepted that this was my life now, imperfect, divided, but finally, gradually, honestly mine again.